Pope Francis has more to say about his critics in America this week, and the upcoming Synod on the Amazon gets more scrutiny from two prominent churchmen. The papal posse, Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, are here with analysis. And the Trump administration wants to severely limit the number of refugees allowed to enter the U.S. this year. But how might that affect those trying to escape religious persecution? Nadine Maenza from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom will tell us. And finally, we'll get story-ented with Rachel Campos Duffy, author of the new picture book, Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, Nadine Maenza, and Rachel Campos Duffy are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send us a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email us at worldover@ewtn.com, but I hardly ever read that. Let's get to the news. Pope Francis made news once again on the papal plane returning from Madagascar on September 10th. He expounded for nearly 90 minutes on recent comments about his critics in America, the role of the UN in a land dispute, ecology and the environment, as well as the upcoming and already controversial Synod on the Amazon. Joining me with analysis of this and much more, and we're going to get into all aspects of it, the papal posse, editor-in-chief at thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, is here in studio, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, joins us from Manhattan. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I want to start with the in-flight papal presser. Pope Francis was asked by Jason Drew Horowitz of the New York Times about comments he made last week about being criticized by American conservative Catholics and media. Horowitz says in Italian, "You acknowledged being under attack by a segment of the American church. Obviously, there is strong criticism from some bishops and cardinals. There are Catholic television stations and American websites that are very critical. And there are even some of your closest allies who've spoken of a plot against you. Is there something that these critics do not understand about your pontificate?" Then the Pope answers, first of all, criticism always helps, always. When someone receives criticism, that person needs to do a self-critique right away and say, is this true or not? To what point? And I always benefit from criticism. Sometimes it makes you angry, but there are advantages. Criticisms are not coming only from Americans, the Pope continued. They are coming a bit from everywhere, even from the Curia. I want to stop there because this is a major admission. As I pointed out last week during my little monologue, this is not an American phenomenon. The criticism is coming from everywhere, even the Curia, as the Holy Father said. Now, Father Jerry, I want you to first address what we talked about last week, mainly that a well-financed conservative movement exists to undermine the Pope and his agenda. Does it?
There's no cabal in the sense of a group of people who meet regularly to formulate plans how to act together. But there is a large segment of opinion makers, we could say, people who are writers, commentators, who follow very closely what the Pope says, the teaching that he's issued, and they, I think very respectfully, but in complete allegiance to the truth, point out inconsistencies between what the Pope has taught and what was taught by the Church up to that time. This started with Amoris Laetitia and the Pope's innovation, saying that some people who live in adulterous second so-called marriages could be given Holy Communion. That has continued when the Pope outlawed capital punishment, said that it is no longer admissible. This is a complete contradiction of the previous teaching of the Church that capital punishment can be used in a moral fashion in some cases. And then it's finally gotten to the Amazon synodal document in which we hear that suddenly pagan religions are a source of revelation for the Church to consult. There was a stop-off in Dubai for the sentence saying that God wills many religions. So these are all points that are, in fact, doctrinal debates that the Pope should engage in. If he truly believes he's correct on these things, then he owes it to his critics to point out how we're wrong, because I've been in one of those critics. Show us how it's consistent rather, what you say, Pope Francis, with what was taught by the Church up to this time.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, the Pope isn't, and is acknowledging that rather, that the criticism isn't only coming from American circles. 3 dubia cardinals were European. Former CDF head Cardinal Mueller is German. Cardinal Sarah is African. Robert, I want you to comment on this. The Pope continued on his plane ride, saying the following: I do not like it when criticism stays under the table. They smile at you, letting you see their teeth, and then they stab you in the back. That is not fair. It is not human. Criticism is a component in construction. And if your criticism is unjust, be prepared to receive a response and get into dialogue and arrive at the right conclusion. This is the dynamic of true criticism. The criticism of the arsenic pills, it's like throwing the stone and then hiding your hand. Now, Bob, how does that square with the dubia cardinal does? I mean, they presented the Pope with what was an invitation to a formal dialogue, no?
Look, what we're seeing here again, as we often see on these plain press conferences, is not a very clear statement of anything, it seems to me. You're exactly right that the dubia cardinals were not primarily Americans. Right. The criticism that appeared after Amoris Laetitia was very widespread because it seemed to challenge a standing doctrine. But it wasn't only there. As we went on and we had some other events, we had the Youth Synod. Right. It was largely the Africans who prevented LGBT material from being introduced there, and then we've seen similar things on other issues. The ironic thing about this, it seems to me, is that the Pope says that he likes criticism because he takes it to heart. And then, we all should, at least in theory, learn something when people tell us that they think we're doing something wrong. Yeah. But there's been no response. The response to the dubia was silence. In fact, the Pope claimed, I don't know how he could claim this, but he claimed that he never heard about the dubia until it was announced in the press years later, almost.
Yeah, a year later, yeah, because they had submitted it a year before, and then getting no response, they went public. Which I think that was the trajectory of it.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we've seen this over and over again. When the Vigano criticism came out, again, another non-American making the criticism, there's been nothing but silence. There've been some very weak statements made by some members of the Curia, like Cardinal Willett, but these were, in my judgment, credible, sincere questions put to the Holy Father about very serious issues, and instead, what we begin to see in sources like the New York Times is this diversion that somehow this is a political or a schismatic movement, rather than what I think most of us feel it is. It's a sincere question about where the Holy Father is leading the Church as a religious entity.
Yeah. Father Jerry, I want you to pick up on this. The Holy Father did talk about schism, as Bob mentioned. He said to criticize without wanting to hear a response and without getting into dialogue is not to have a good of the Church at heart. It is chasing after a fixed idea to change the Pope or to create a schism. In the Church, there is always the option for schism, always. But it is an option that the Lord leaves to human freedom. I'm not afraid of schisms, the Pope said. I pray that there will be none, because what is at stake is people's spiritual health. Let there be dialogue. Let there be correction if there is an error. But the schismatic path is not Christian. The schismatics always have one thing in common. They separate themselves from the people of God, from the faith of the people of God. Father Jerry, we're back to this kind of American cabal narrative that you hear there, which is being propagated in progressive circles, that conservatives are questioning the radical changes underway, and are therefore fomenting schism. But aren't they reflecting the faith of the people of God that the Pope references?
Yes, Raymond, schism, understood properly, is to refuse to recognize the authority in the Church. So a schismatic is someone who operates in opposition to the legitimate commands or directions given by Church authority. The Pope says he's not afraid of a schism, but then he says schism has implications for spiritual welfare of people. So I'm really stunned that he would say he's not bothered by the idea of a synod because it's happened before, it could happen again. Rather, I think the Pope is the shepherd of the Church. the idea that part of the flock would drift away and it doesn't bother him, I find that very troubling. No, the point of the matter is the American people that I talk to who are concerned about the teaching coming from Rome, they harbor no desire to reject the Roman pontiff. Their desire is that the Roman pontiff's teaching be reconciled with the constant teaching of the Church, and that's why all this effort is spent. You know, how many articles, how many petitions, the Dubia Cardinals, books have been written trying to say, Holy Father, the things that you say do not sound correct. In fact, they contradict in certain areas what's always been taught. Please help us to understand what you mean so that we don't mistakenly accuse you of turning away from that constant teaching. That is a very good and submissive attitude
I think that's
faithful.
I think that's right, brother. I don't see, and nor do I hear from anybody, and certainly not in this audience. I don't get emails, people saying, we've got to reject this pope, we're trying to create our new church. That's not at all what's underway here. I think what happened is they try to conflate, and I spoke of this last week, the kind of 4 degrees of separation. Well, you had dinner with that person, or you spoke at that, or interviewed that person, so you must be aligned. This is crazy talk. And I think they took the Vigano call for resignation and then attached that to anyone questioning the changes in Rome. But that's just not so. I expressed my displeasure and disagreement with that from the onset. I think we're in agreement. No one here is calling for the Pope to resign or to create an alternative church. That again, is also crazy talk. I want to expand on something the Pope said during his plane ride, Bob. Right after he said that schismatics are people who separate themselves from the faith of the people of God, he went on and said, and when there is a discussion in the Council of Ephesus regarding Mary's divine maternity, the people, this is history, were at the entrance of the cathedral while the bishops entered in to take part in the council. They were there with clubs. They made the bishops see them as they shouted, Mother of God, as if to say, if you do not do this, this is what you can expect, the club. The people of God always correct and helpful. A schism is always an elitist separation stemming from an ideology detached from doctrine, to which Raymond Arroyo says, Amen, Holy Father. Amen. Your reaction?
Yeah, look, as we know, look, there is no schism on the table in the United States. And let me explain to some of our viewers tonight. One of the things, if you are often in the company of people abroad, is that they have this outsized notion of the United States. And it's true. We're the biggest dog. They cannot control the United States. It's the most powerful country on earth. Our media are the most powerful and the most influential in the world. So it looks like the United States is something, that they have to fear in a variety of ways. But to go back to the Pope's initial remark, it's remarkable to me, it's even shocking to me, that he says, I don't fear this. I think as a human being, you would have to fear schism, precisely for the reasons he says, because souls are at stake. And it's a turning into his own sort of psychology to say, I don't fear this, but this happened in the past, and he's sort of reassuring himself that there's nothing horrible that's going to happen here. Look, we know that the criticisms that have been the most cogent by people in the Vatican and in other countries in the world are based on actual facts out there in the world. They are not an attempt to split off into some other church. They are an attempt to try to preserve this unity that the church has always had internationally. It's one of the most remarkable things about this institution that God created.
Which is why I did smile when I read that portion about the people of God are always helpful. They're always correct and helpful. Well, this is the people of God responding. Now, they don't have clubs in their hands. Not yet. But
they're very worried.
They are very vocal.
They're very vocal, and they're very worried. Because why? Because marriage is so much under threat in our society that to kind of give the impression that, well, if you're divorced and remarried, we can massage that. It upsets very many people. Well, they're not outside beating the drums about the Amazon Synod and hoping that we can all go back and talk to shamans so that we can be in harmony with nature and with creation again. They're actually very worried that we're going back to a kind of primitivism that's actually a sentimental and first world version of what actually the indigenous peoples are, rather than embracing the fullness of what God has given us and we've been able to develop in civilization and in Christianity itself.
Coming out of his comments on criticism and schism, the Holy Father remarked on one of his favorite subjects, rigidity. He related it to the Pelagian, which we'll explain in a moment. He said this: a morality based on such a Pelagian ideology leads you to rigidity. And today we have many schools of rigidity within the church, which are not schisms, but pseudo-schisms, Christian developments that will end badly. When you see rigid Christians, bishops, priests, there are problems behind that, not gospel holiness. So we need to be gentle with those who are tempted by these attacks. They are going through a tough time. We must accompany them gently. Father, most Catholics' eyes glaze over when you hear reference to Pelagianism. Explain what the reference is and your reaction to that comment.
Yeah, so, okay, the two terms here are important are rigidity and Pelagianism. So rigidity is the imputing a psychological disorder to someone who is tradition-bound or fixed upon certain things that they will never give up. So a rigid person is someone who has a psychological deficiency in their life, and they then, according to this analysis, hide behind fidelity to Catholic doctrine as a way to give themselves some kind of psychological security. This is a calumny that I've been hearing since I was in the seminary. You know, in the real world, people who are steadfast in the faith and go to death for it are called martyrs. We don't call them rigid personalities who then shed their blood because they thought this was what they needed to do. No, these are people who said, my Savior went to the cross. I would rather die than deny any of his teachings. Now, Pelagianism is a heresy which teaches that grace is not necessary for man to be saved, that he can do it on his own. But again, this can be used in a very wrong way to say fidelity to the teaching of the Church, which requires a lot of struggle, looks like some kind of self-salvation. This is not the case at all. It's very, very disturbing that the Pope is imputing to people who are very steadfast in their doctrinal fidelity that they have psychological disorders and therefore needed to be treated gently. I mean, this is the kind of advice, I think, that is patronizing and is not really shepherdly. You know, let's be honest here. The Pope was a bishop in Buenos Aires. He ran a seminary. And did he find all the candidates who were rigid, you know, that these were people with psychological deficiencies? That's not to understand who these people are. If after the Second Vatican Council, if you didn't believe in the doctrine of the faith, why would you want to become a priest? For me, I never liked this criticism because I think it really is cruel. And I'm sorry that the Pope uses this language. He spoke to the bishops of Mozambique in the same sentiment. And I'm scratching my head. I've dealt with lots of priests from Africa. You know, to say that there's rigidity, meaning psychological disorder leading to traditionalism, this is not the reality. Yeah. This is an imposition of a fixed idea.
Well, you know, I don't have it in front of me, but Monsignor Charles Pope here in Washington, Bob, said how personally offended and wounded he was over these comments, and that he really feels as if he's being beaten up, bullied. I'm paraphrasing him. I know from my email over the last week, a lot of priests are feeling that way. And they keep saying, Holy Father, we love you. We want to be your loyal sons. We are your loyal sons. Help us through this period. There is a separation and an alienation right now between these comments and the clergy.
Well, look, let's get back up here a little bit. We know from the Pope's own admitted autobiography that he himself was, he believes, too rigid when he was a younger priest. And that through various things that happened in the course of his life, he began to overcome that and became more pastoral, etc. However, there's a difference between a person who is doctrinally faithful and is insistent on the faith, and his father says is willing, as the martyrs did throughout history, to die even for the Eucharist, for the truths of the faith, and a person who acts in relation to other people in a way that's offensive and inappropriate and obviously, you know, somewhere off. There's a distinction between those two things, and one can be both extremely orthodox and extremely pastoral toward other human beings. I've known many priests like this. I've known many lay people like this, and I think we all have. Yeah. So there's a category confusion here that I think is also. It's not only offensive, I find it judgmental. It's judging at a distance people that you don't know personally when in fact they're their very orthodoxy, as in the case of Mother Teresa, may lead to the most merciful and the most pastoral activities that we know of.
Right. I want to move on to the Synod on the Amazon region coming up in October. The working document has been criticized for its focus on a very small Catholic population in one of the most remote parts of the world, and its focus on the possibility of married priests to alleviate the priest shortage. In recent weeks, clergymen and missionaries who have actually served in the Amazon have been critical of the working document and its misplaced attention to certain aspects of the church in the region. The lack of actual Catholics, the rise of Pentecostalism, child abuse, pedophilia are all factors in the Amazon that are never mentioned in the document. Father, why is this synod focused on married priests and environmental concerns when there doesn't seem to be the Catholic population to support that level of emphasis or global awareness?
Raymond, you make a great point there. It's a good question to ask. You know, the more hard-headed look is to say the Amazon Synod is ostensibly about serving people in the jungle, but what it's really about is getting a married clergy into the Catholic priesthood. And I think that really is what the story is here. The German influence on this synod, and we just learned now that Cardinal Marx will be a member of the synod. That is a papal decision. But why in the world is Germany so involved in a discussion about what's going on in a continent where they don't even speak German? No, the reality is, and I've lived myself as a seminarian in Ecuador, the mission of the church that being carried on in South America involves many triumphs, many defeats, but it involves, above all, a fidelity to Christ and a witness that Christ's truth is the only saving truth. This document was produced by people who are introducing elements of paganism, false theology, heretical notions. You know, Cardinal Burke and Archbishop Schneider.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a moment.
Okay, well, I'll let you talk about that. But
I want to get to that.
Look, the reality is things are happening here that are unimaginable 10 years ago under Pope Benedict. And people scratch and say, why is this happening? And the only answer is Pope Francis is letting it happen. We're here as loyal children say, Pope Francis, don't let this happen. This isn't for the good of the church.
Father Jerry, before I go to Bob, Cardinal Marx, who you mentioned a moment ago from Germany, he was quoted this week as saying he could well picture that one can come to the conclusion that it is good to admit married priests in certain regions under certain conditions coming out of this synod. Your reaction?
Well, he's basically saying the truth that he wants a married clergy, and certain regions, does that include Germany in his mind? The same circumstances that are alleged for Amazonia, that there aren't enough young men who are entering the celibate priesthood, they apply in Germany. Cardinal Marx ordained, I think, 1 or 2 people last year in his Archdiocese of Munich. The decline in the Catholic Church in Germany is stunning, and for him to say he can see a married clergy in certain regions with an S on the end of that word region means they're thinking beyond Amazonia.
Right.
This is what's going on here. This is a subversion right in the sunshine of a full day, and we have to say, stop it. It would be a total disaster to make celibacy optional. It would abolish celibacy. It would cause huge dislocation of life of the church. And basically, it's an abandonment of what Jesus himself lived. Jesus was celibate for a reason. And his clergy who represent him should follow that example. And that's what the Latin Church has said for its existence.
As Father Jerry previewed a moment ago, Cardinal Raymond Burke and Bishop Athanasius Schneider have announced a crusade of prayer and fasting to prevent what they're calling, quote, errors and heresies, end quote, in the working document from being approved. They're asking the faithful to pray a decade of the Rosary and fast at least one day a week from September 17th to October 26th. And they've issued an 8-page document with 6 very specific concerns about the working document. Principal errors, they call them. We'll put them on the screen. Implicit pantheism, pagan superstitions as sources of divine revelation. Aboriginal people have been received divine or have already received divine revelation. Tailoring Catholic ordained ministry to Aboriginal customs. They believe it relativizes Christian anthropology and something called ecological conversion. Bob, Cardinal Burke and Bishop Schneider say these are implicit and explicit errors and an alarming manifestation of confusion in the church today. Your reaction?
Look, for me, I could put all 6 of these together into one principle, and it has something to do with the fact that they're looking for a married priesthood, and maybe women also involved in ministerial activities of some kind. But the problem, the central problem with these 6 things that these 2 figures have quite rightly identified, is that the activity is not directed towards evangelization of the peoples. To my mind, it's partly reforming the church itself along the lines that Father was just talking about, which are really first world concerns, and that the environmental concerns are there to kind of soften things and make it easier to do the things that are really going on. Because if you look at the kind of doubts that are raised about proselytizing, and meanwhile, the Protestants are going to gangbusters.
They're eating up all of Amazonia.
Places. You could almost say that if St. Paul were to show up in the Amazon, they would tell him, look, you can't talk, you just have to be a witness here and live among us, and you don't tell it. But St. Paul did the right thing. We know from our histories in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles that St. Paul goes to Athens. He sees the statue of the unknown God. The Greeks had, like all peoples everywhere, have some intuitions. God doesn't leave all people without intuitions about who he is. But St. Paul comes along and says, I saw, men of Athens, I saw that you have this statue to the unknown God. I'm going to tell you who that real God is. That type of evangelizing focus, that energy of moving into the Amazon, I don't see that. I see a lot of energy about reforming the priesthood and reforming other things inside the church itself that apply outside, and mostly letting stand these cultures, these ancestral leaders, these ancestral ways, rather than seeking to imbue them with the gospel and energize them to be fully alive to what God has revealed to us.
Father Jerry, I have only a few seconds here, and then I've got to get one more topic in. Will this go the way of Cardinal Burke's dubia? Will their concerns really have any impact on this train the Church finds itself on?
Well, we know from the airplane interviews that the Pope does pay attention to public opinion, and he does pay attention to criticism. Now, he tells us he wants good criticism. I consider this document by the Cardinal and the Bishop to be good criticism. Our hope is that the Pope's advisors will tell him that it's not enough to simply say, I like getting criticism, but then I don't really have to answer it, that he will have to answer it. And let's hope and pray on the Synod floor that there will be some brave voices who get up and say the concerns raised by Cardinal Burke and Bishop Schneider need to be answered and not simply dismissed as, again, signs of rigid personalities who have to be treated, as if they were children needing some guidance. No, these are serious Catholic bishops who want the faith to shine forward and not be lost in this miasm, this quicksand of heretical and pagan notions, and that's quite frankly what this working document does propose.
I want to move to one quick topic before we go, and it relates to the Amazon. Italian journalist Sandro Magister posted a story this week about deacons already being allowed to say Mass in the Amazon region. Now, according to Magister, who links to a video of a Father Giovanni Niccolini of Bologna, that incidentally is the same diocese that the newly appointed Cardinal Matteo Zuppi oversees, this priest relates an anecdote about a deacon being allowed and encouraged to say Mass in the Amazon region with the express approval of the local bishop and the implicit approval of Pope Francis himself. Father, your quick reaction to this, and I'm going to go to Bob.
If this is true, if that priest is accurately reporting something, then it is horrendous and it is an ecclesiastical crime. To simulate celebrating Mass when you are not a priest is a canonical offense. Deacons cannot celebrate Mass, period. They don't have the power to do it. To attempt to do it is a canonical crime. As a bishop, to approve of it, this is also a canonical crime because you're fostering an offense against the dignity of the Holy Eucharist. So if this is true, this must be dealt with and stopped immediately because it undermines Catholic teaching and the hierarchical responsibility to safeguard that teaching.
Bob, is this a preview of what we could see on the other end of this synod for Amazon?
Yeah, for me, this is freelance Catholicism. We've had other cases, women in Argentina saying that the Holy Father says, you're divorced and remarried, but you can still go and receive communion and similar things like this. What the exact quote is, and Magister is careful to say this has not been corroborated by other sources, but the exact quote is, the Holy Father said, yes, go ahead, but nothing can be written for now. Which the second part of this actually makes me feel that it's more authentic because, yes, go ahead is just what somebody says. Right. But for this report to be that he went on to say that we can't actually publicize this in any kind of formal way for the time being, that sounds to me like the kind of thing somebody might say in a private conversation. And if so, I mean, we're again in this situation where the Pope is doing some things that don't seem to be proper in his role. Allegedly. His proper role as the universal pastor, the person of unity who tries to bring us all together in the faith, saying things on his own steam that don't seem to be part of our tradition. But I guess we'll find out if those things are true or not on the other side of the Synod.
And you'll have a front row seat
I will be in Rome for the entirety of the Synod.
God bless you. And you'll be checking in with us throughout. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you both for being here. And you can find commentary from the entire papal posse at thecatholicthing.org. Nadine Maenza is up next, but first, some news. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court gave the Trump administration permission to enforce its toughest restriction yet on asylum seekers at the southern border. The government can now refuse to consider asylum requests from anyone who failed to apply for it before coming to the United States. Migrants from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador now cannot seek asylum in the U.S. if they didn't first ask for it in Mexico. Most people crossing the southern border are Central Americans. The shift reverses decades of U.S. policy. The administration says it wants to close the time gap between initial screening and a final decision on asylum. Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor dissented, saying the court acted too quickly and should allow the case to work its way through the lower courts. Also this week, the Trump administration wants to cut the number of refugees allowed into the United States this year. How will these tough restrictions affect refugees who are fleeing real religious persecution? And what message does it send to the rest of the world? Joining me now to discuss is Vice Chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, Nadine Maenza. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Last year, the administration capped the refugee program at 30,000, and that was down from 45,000 in 2018. Since 2016, the number of refugees is down 71%, Nadine. Now, it seems the administration is looking to take that number from 30,000 to zero. Your thoughts on why this is happening?
Well, we know that the administration is trying to make that decision right now, so there are people that have different opinions that are meeting together to discuss that, and that's why we at the Commission decided now is the right time for us to weigh in to make our own recommendation. We're created as a bipartisan, independent government body, and our mandate is to make recommendations to our own government. So we're recommending that they don't zero out the refugee cap.
Why not?
Because we feel for a couple different reasons. First of all, in terms of our advocacy for religious freedom, it will make it very difficult for the State Department or the Commission when we go overseas and we advocate for religious minorities to say to a government to value those minorities, value those Christians, the other minorities in your country. They have dignity. They deserve to have a role in your government when we won't take any of them.
Now, the administration, and I've spoken to some officials throughout the government, they claim this is a national security concern, that they're concerned about that.
We definitely recommend vetting. Right now, it's a couple years before a refugee can come to the United States, and then the United States, it goes through a process where they vet them themselves. So I think it's easy for us to misunderstand a refugee from someone who's displaced and fleeing war or fleeing violence. A refugee is somebody that can't go back. They're somebody that are fleeing something pretty severe, that they've been given that special status.
I want to give people an insight into the number of refugees seeking asylum due to religious persecution. According to World Relief, the number of Muslims is down 90% in the past 3 years, and there's been a 47% drop in Christian refugees. In addition, there's 72% decrease in Christians from the 50 countries on the World Watch list in which Christians face the most persecution. Now, this seems to contradict the administration's goal, Nadine, of protecting and promoting religious freedom and religious minorities.
We would really like the administration, as they decide what this number is, to just consider that fact that we've had these two ministerials focusing on religious freedom.
Right.
We are a leader fighting for religious freedom, and having a zero refugee cap in particular would be harmful for that work that we do that's so important. There has never been an administration better on religious freedom, more forceful than this administration. So we at the Commission are so pleased by that, and we really don't want us to hurt our own efforts by making such a drastic decision.
Now, I've spoken also to some administration officials when I heard you were coming on, and they say, look, we're trying to send the resources to the region where these people are being displaced so that they can stay in that region and hopefully one day go back. And they feel that's more cost-effective and, frankly, safer for the refugee and the people in the United States to keep them in the region. Your response to that?
Well, certainly if people want to stay in the region and can stay in the region, they can go back. We're not disagreeing that, of course, we don't want every religious minority to leave the Middle East, for instance. But I was just in Jordan meeting with, I was just in Iraq and then in Jordan, and I met with some Iraqi Christian refugees. And they haven't been able to go back. It's not safe.
Even the groups specifically identified by the United States, Christians and Yazidis in Iraq, in Syria. During 2016, the U.S. admitted 1,500 Iraqi Christians and 417 Yazidis. So far this year, they've admitted 41 Christians and 9 Yazidis.
Exactly, and we did designate that violence as genocide, which does raise it to a level that demands a different action from us. So we do feel like these would be contributing citizens. But we also think vetting is important, and no one is suggesting that's not.
So where is the disconnect? Because on the one hand, you've got Mike Pompeo doing his ministerials. We covered that. You've got a true renewed attention to religious freedom and persecution. But yet there seems to be this blind spot on allowing religious refugees into the country.
Well, we're hoping that once they do make their decision, it won't be inconsistent, which is why we've decided to weigh in, because we do agree that it does fit our values to allow people that are fleeing. I mean, you're talking about pastors from China, from Iran, North Korea, Uyghur Muslims that are able to escape a concentration camp. In China, is there no place in the United States for them? And I'll be honest, when we cut our refugee numbers in the past, the United Nations told us everyone cut their numbers. So if we think other countries are going to pick up the slack, they're not. They're going to follow our lead, which means these people will have to live their whole lives in refugee camps, and their children will, and they will be the underclass. They will never get the education they deserve. So the consequence of that, and of course radicalization in those instances as well. So there's all sorts of reasons that that's not a good idea.
Well, and this is civil society. We have to remember, many of these people fleeing religious persecution, this is the civilization and the greatest hope in some cases for these regions. If you isolate them and put them on refugee camps, you're killing the future.
Exactly, and we know that if we lead and all the other countries also accept some refugees, there are places for a lot of these people to start over, the ones that can't go back.
There are reports the administration is saying, look, we've had to divert our resources where we would normally deal with refugees. We've had to focus on asylum seekers at the southern border. And that's where we're spending our money, our energy, our people, and our time. Your response? I
think we can do both. I think we're a really great country. The program, the way it's set up now, is their costs are covered when they fly over, but they have to repay them. We should be bringing people that can go to work, that can join our community. And this family I met in Iraq, the mother is a hairdresser, the father is a teacher. They would contribute to the society. They'd come here and they would work. They'd pay taxes, and we feel like that you can do both.
What happened to the administration's priority? I distinctly remember President Trump running on a platform of saying, we're going to give preference to Christian refugees seeking escape from this Middle East horror and the Islamic terror they're facing in those countries. What happened to that promise? I know the courts battered him around a bit.
Well, a little bit too with the United Nations, the way that it works. A lot of times they go through and they make a list of the refugees that they're resettling, and they go to the camps, and that's where it starts. And a lot of the Christians aren't in those settings, so they don't get included in that. So that's definitely the whole process is something we should take a look at.
Now, there are two plans at play according to reports. One, they want to halve the number of refugees in this upcoming year. The other would end them and bring them to zero, giving the president the ability to waive that in certain emergency cases. Which of those scenarios do you like?
Yeah, we would prefer that it not even be cut in half. We think 30, which is where it is right now, is pretty low as it is.
And 15,000 you think would be unacceptable?
So low. Certainly 0 is we're hoping is an unacceptable, that's just a negotiating ploy, but we're hoping that it will be higher than that. But we do hope that they will make room for all those fleeing persecution.
Where is the need most urgent? I mean, you all study this, watch it. Which regions of the world are you seeing the most need?
Well, certainly right now we're seeing a lot coming from Africa. I think those have been some of our top numbers. But there's still a need in the Middle East. We have Burma has been persecuting the Muslims there horribly, and of course China. For those that can get out. A lot of them will go to jail or disappear if they don't have somebody take them. And we're talking about if spending their life as a refugee, if they're not able to be resettled, it means they usually can't work in the country they reside. Their children often can't go to school. Like right now, the Iraqi family that's in Jordan, their family, they can't work, or their children can go to school. So they're in this limbo where they can't go back because they tried to go back and they were told if you go back, more of your family will die. So they're stuck in this limbo. They're not able to be resettled in another country. They're not able to work. They're not able to go to school. So what can we offer these families? And of course, they can become part of our community. We do have room. So I think that we need to understand that there's, no one's suggesting we just open our borders and let everyone come that wants to come. This is very strategic. But we do believe there should be a room for those that are fleeing persecution.
Now, former Defense Secretary Mattis and others have been very supportive of the refugee program. And they look at this not through a humanitarian lens, but through a strategic lens, because they say, wait a minute, these are our allies on the ground. This is intelligence coming into our country that we need if we're going to be effective in the field. Your thought on that, and where is the current Defense Department?
It's really interesting you say that, because it seems they have always been the most in favor of the refugee program. It gives them the ability to reward people that have risked their life to assist them. And a lot of times it's classified. We don't know the whole stories, but we do know people like translators and others. They go into these countries, they assist them, they help them, and then they're able, and they know that they're friends of the United States, they love the United States, and they are able to resettle them there. I think for them to not have that ability to offer those, and to also be seen the same way that we're talking about, to be able to go into a country, urge the government to treat minorities with respect, urge them to treat their people well, and then to also be willing to take those that have to flee. So I do think that they probably feel like it would hurt their ability to just come in with that as well.
What would you tell the president if you could sit down with him today about these religious minorities? What do you think they're missing?
I'm not sure how. I think the president cares deeply about people of faith. He's shown that in this country. And that there's a way that we can safely have them come here, join our community, especially people fleeing persecution, that can be done safely. And they don't have to be a national security risk. No one's suggesting that. We're just suggesting that we be a place where those can come and join us.
Nadine, thank you so much
Thanks
for your input and for your clarity. We'll check in with you on this issue.
Thank you so much.
You can find out more about Nadine Maenza and the work of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom at uscirf.gov. Finally, it's time to get story-ented. She's the mother of 8, soon to be 9, a Fox News contributor, and the wife of a certain U.S. congressman from Wisconsin. Despite all of that, she's found time to write a new picture book for kids called Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom. She's here to tell us about the book and much more. Please welcome back to the program, Rachel Campos Duffy. Rachel, tell me, where did this concept originate for this book, Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom?
So it started when we came to the Capitol for the first time as a family after my husband was elected. Sean had never been to the Capitol before. I'd never been to the Capitol before. And so we brought the kids. They'd never been. And one of my kids was 4 years old at the time, Paloma. She fell in love with the building. It is magnificent. It's gorgeous. And she noticed something that I hadn't noticed, which was that there's this gorgeous statue at the top of it. And she wanted to know all about it. And I, as her mom, tried to figure out what it was. And I learned about it and taught her about it. And she said she wanted to be her. And the reason I know she was so serious about it is she had all these great questions. She wanted to know if she did it, when she grew up, if she became Lady Freedom, could she come down? Would the sword be too heavy? Could her siblings come up and visit her? So this idea started to, formulate for me, because I thought she wants to be Lady Freedom, but all of us who are, whether we're protecting life or religious liberty or American capitalism, we are all protecting freedom. We all want to be Lady Freedoms. And so that's sort of the idea of it. I also lost Paloma once in Disney World, which was the worst moment of my life. And so you and I actually had a little conversation about this where you said, you need to find something. And I said, losing her in the Capitol. And you said, that's it. And so that's where this idea that she gets lost in the Capitol. And while she's lost, she discovers why her father, who's an immigrant and brought her there to celebrate being an American, wanted her to come. And she discovers why it's so important to be an American, why she's so lucky to be an American, and also a little bit about American history, which kids don't get enough of these days.
Yeah, and then there's a beautiful, tragic moment where she's deported at the end of the book. But we won't. No, I'm kidding.
I'm
totally kidding. No, but it is significant that the family it's an immigrant family. Her father's a naturalized citizen who's very proud of being an American.
Yes, absolutely.
So tell me, what was the idea behind? I mean, that's intentional. This could have been the Duffy family with Paloma.
Right, we could have just gone to the Capitol.
Why did you decide to create this fictional family and an immigrant family at that?
So my mother, around the same age that I was, when I was this little girl's age, my mother became a U.S. citizen as well. And so we hear so much about immigration in the news and even in children's literature. If you go, there's a lot of stories, especially for young readers, about these sad, tragic stories of people being deported. I think we're forgetting to tell our kids, the story of legal immigration, which is a beautiful story. I mean, the most patriotic person I know is my mother, and I think it's because she went through that process. So I wanted to tell the story of a legal immigrant going through that process and the kind of pride and love of country that comes through that. But also, there's so much emphasis these days, and you know it because you love children's literature as well. There's this overemphasis, almost obsession with diversity, which is, of course, what makes us different. I wanted to talk about what unites us as Americans, especially now when everyone's complaining about how polemic and divisive everything is. What are the values that unite us? Love of freedom, the pursuit of the American dream, our American history, all of that is in that book. And that's what I hope it unleashes everybody's inner patriot, especially kids who aren't getting enough of that.
And why was the Lady Freedom theme so important to you? I mean, it's one thing for your daughter to say, oh, look, who's that? What's that statue? But why did it take on such significance for you to want to commemorate it in a book? Capture it?
I actually thought about it. I mean, this is our founders who, the Abraham Lincoln Commission. This is a gorgeous statue. If you haven't seen it, you really should Google it. It is the most gorgeous. You can see it up close. You can see it at the Visitor Center. It's such a beautiful statue. But just think, at the highest point in our nation's capital, they put a woman. Our founders put a woman, symbolizing, this protection of our liberty. She's fighting for it. She's defending. In fact, she faces east because she is watching England. She's so vigilant of our freedom, so protective of it. And I think in this moment, I do think we're in an existential battle politically as well, where, a lot of the things that we thought our country stood for, again, religious liberty, life, free enterprise, these things are all under attack. And I think it's a wonderful time for us to talk about values that we've always had that are somehow getting lost.
Yeah. What do you want families, particularly, I imagine, young girls, to take away from this book?
Love of America. I mean, honestly, just love of America. It seems like whether it's Colin Kaepernick and so many other things that are happening in our culture where, presidential candidates who are constantly, complaining about America. America doesn't live up to this. America doesn't live up to that. They always seem so disappointed in us as Americans. And for me, I'm a military brat. I grew up with a different idea about what America is, and I wanted to share that. And I actually, I work on the Fox News Network. I travel around the country giving speeches, and I believe that most people love this country. There's a reason why there aren't, 800,000 young DACA kids trying to get into Caracas, or or into Mexico City. I mean, there's a reason why people risk their lives. Do all kinds of stuff, wait in line for 15, 20 years to become Americans. There's something about this.
Well, we had your husband, Sean Duffy, Congressman Sean Duffy, on last week talking about his retirement from Congress. Do you really want him underfoot every day of the week? I want the exclusive on this.
Well, here's the exclusive. I'm about to have a baby in about a month. I'm nesting. He's going to be home more, and he's going to wish he was back in Congress because I have a long list of stuff that I want him to do. So yes, no, we miss each other. People don't get
it's
that
hard.
it's a hard life. There's 2 full-time schedulers to manage 1 congressman's work schedule and life. And so, I'm proud of the 8.5 years that he served. I think it's the greatest honor that our family ever had. My little kids, when they see the screen, the TV screen, and see a picture of the Capitol when the news is on, they say that's Daddy's office. And that's an amazing opportunity and honor that our family has had. But I also believe in citizen legislators. I think it's time for, we did our time to, I say we did our time like we were in jail. We weren't in jail, but we served as a family because there's a lot of sacrifice for everybody involved. But we could start to see that there were just too many things that we were missing family-wise.
Whether it's the military, whether it's serving in the Congress, I think it's a time of service, not a lifetime appointment or tenure. This is a good and healthy thing, I think, that he's doing. I know
think
it's hard, too.
It is. It's hard, but I agree. I think it's healthy for our democracy.
Right.
New ideas, fresh ideas. Also,
New blood.
he's young. He could go and he could come back, at some future point if he felt like it. But, he might really like, being a civilian.
So handyman and plumbing is in his future.
If he gets tired of doing chores for me, he'll probably run for office again.
Okay. I have to ask you a question. I ask these of every author who comes on the program.
All right.
Your favorite children's book and why?
So it's not like super young, but it is young readers, children's literature. I love Nancy Drew. I grew up on Nancy Drew. I think Nancy Drew, for girls in particular, was the ultimate role model. I wanted to be just like her. I loved how brave she was. I loved how feminine she remained. I loved that she had a convertible. My first car was a convertible. I'm absolutely convinced it's because of Nancy Drew. I was
a Hardy Boys Encyclopedia Brown reader. And I never cracked open a Nancy Drew. I would see her on the cover and go, I'll get another Hardy Boys.
I was not a big Hardy Boys.
Hardy Boys.
No.
You see?
So there is something about that.
Yes.
I think Nancy Drew was the ultimate. And by the way, if you read it to your kids nowadays, it's really fun because they'll be like, well, why can't she call someone from the basement if she's trapped? I'm like, there were no cell phones back then. They don't understand any of it. Yeah, no reception. There were no phones even.
Right.
So, it's a fun thing to read, and they get an idea of what life was like. And courtship, remember the courtship between her and Ned. Lots of fun stuff.
Wow. Least favorite children's book and why?
I hate any of those like Barbie books, and my kids love them, but they always seem to have no storyline. They're just kind of dumb. And so, I hate those kind of books.
The story that helped you find your path, and what was it? What was the lesson you gleaned from it?
A children's book?
Well, it can be an adult one.
I read The Alchemist a long time ago, and it was sort of like this story of finding out what your passion is, and I really enjoyed that book, and I felt like at that time in my life I needed that kind of direction. By the way, the other favorite book was not mine, but all my kids. Little Red Barn.
Oh, the Little Red Barn.
We probably buy 2 Little Red Barn books a year because they get so used up in our house and touched and broken and.
Wow.
So maybe it's a Wisconsin thing.
Yeah, that's a love book. I don't know the Little Red Barn.
You don't know?
No, this missed me totally.
Okay, all right.
Treasure Island, Huck Finn.
I love Treasure Island. I just read that this summer with the kids.
It's such a great book.
Yeah.
Where do you write and why?
At night, when no one's around, usually. But I would say this book was a little different. I worked with my daughter, Lucia, and that's what was such a great experience for me. She is 15 years old. She was 14 when we wrote it. She is sort of really between being a teenager, but still, I catch her, she still plays with her sisters. And so she understood a lot of kid things and caught things that I wouldn't have caught. So it was a really great experience. She should be a marketer. I learned a lot about her doing this book with her. So.
I love it. Okay, where do your best ideas come from?
In the shower.
Mine too, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, or when I'm walking down airport terminals.
I get that too.
When you're moving.
Yeah.
Feet moving are a good thing. So an author once told me when when you're moving the souls, the other one works too.
Oh, that's right.
And
That's
it's
good.
true. You're moving. You're moving.
Yeah.
If you could pick a writing mentor, alive or dead, whom would it be?
I think Raymond Arroyo.
Oh, my.
I mean, you've been very good to me. I mean, I've bounced a lot of ideas off of you. I think you're brutally honest, which is good.
See, some people like honesty. I hope all my critics are watching.
But yeah, you know, I've bounced a lot of stuff off of you, and I think my book is better for having done that.
Yeah, well, sometimes I think it's easy. It's always easier to see problems in someone else's story.
It's true.
You cannot see them in your own.
No.
And I keep after I write, I leave a lot of distance. I put it in the drawer for 3 weeks and I won't look at it because you're too close and you know the blood that went into every sentence.
Yeah.
So when you have the distance, it gives you a different perspective. But it's hard.
Yeah,
but
it
I
is
thank
hard.
you. That's very nice. Advice to parents to get your children to read.
They should see you reading. And it's interesting. I do a lot of reading on my phone. I literally read like for work, like articles and stuff. And it's just not the same. I mean, they need to see you sitting down actually reading a book, which, by the way, is hard these days. We're all so distracted. There's so much going on. But that's a good thing.
Critical. It's time spent. They're bonding with you in a way that you'll never replicate. Because, as you said about Nancy Drew, you can share your history, your values, your perspective on life. They're absorbing that without knowing it because they're lost in the story.
Absolutely.
Such a great gift.
I once interviewed Megan Cox Verdun about her book, The Enchanted Hour.
Great book.
And it's a great book, and it reminded me of why I actually started reading more after reading to the kids more after reading that. Because it's all intuitive what she's telling you is happening, but you almost have to see the scientific data behind how important it is to do that. And yeah, you know, and at different phases, like even with my daughter, I'm not a Harry Potter person, but my oldest daughter loves Harry Potter and now reads to her siblings Harry Potter. So there's a lot of interesting things that happen in a family, you know, introducing what you value.
Yeah, your likes and dislikes. And I read something great this week from an educator who said, give your child the freedom to dislike books. Certain books, to say, I don't want to read that.
Why?
Well, so that now they're in the active participation of deciding, I like this, I don't like trucks, I don't want to read about fire engines, I want to read about oceans and mammals. You know,
so
you let them
I
choose.
get that at the young phase. I'm guilty of like when
Imposing.
Yeah, because I'm like, why don't you pick up Treasure Island? You know, why don't you read Pollyanna? You know, and there's so many other things coming out. And I mean, children's literature is actually very vibrant right now. There's a lot of stuff out there.
It's a bad idea. I always tell parents this. And look, no one loves the classics, Shakespeare, Moliere, more than me. However, I think there's a real problem we have in our educational system of imposing that on kids before they're ready for it.
That's
and
true.
I think you should take them to the theater to watch it rather than making them read it. That's what I did with my kids. They got Shakespeare.
Smart.
We went to see it, or we pulled up the BBC versions. We watched together and worked our way through the language. It's the only way to feel it, because otherwise the language it's all too foreign. There's so many foreign concepts.
When the parent is the actor as well.
That is true. And when you got two in the household, then you really got something. Yes, it's big.
You know what? That you learn something every day. That's actually very good advice.
It's good. Well, it was meant to be. It was meant to be performed, not to read.
Totally.
And so when you read it later, you'll get it, and all the pictures come back. If you could write anything else, what would it be? And you've written parenting books. You've written now children's books. Do you want to do another one of these?
I do. I really love
Picture
the process.
books?
Do you know why I like picture books? Because
No.
I love the creative process. I actually do. I love working with the artist, and I like the idea of having an input on that. And I did have a visual of what I wanted, and I was really lucky to find Richard Johnson, who I think really captured what I wanted. So I do. I love the creative process.
That collaborative process.
Yeah. Also, it's not as long as the process you put yourself through.
This is true. 330 pages is a lot longer.
It's a lot of work.
But you know what? That collaborative process is there as well, with maps and illustrations and the covers.
Yes.
Oh, the covers.
The covers.
And like you, I've been blessed with great illustrators. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Raymond. It's always fun to come on your show.
It's great.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you soon.
All right.
Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom by Rachel Campos Duffy is available at bookstores everywhere and online. That's all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. You can like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Mary Ann Glendon, the chair of the new U.S. Commission on Unalienable Rights, will be here. Until then, will be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.